In the unforgiving dust of the Dakota Territory, a woman's worth was measured by the narrowness of her waist and the swiftness of her hands. For Clara May Thompson, a woman built for winter's hardship rather than a summer's fancy, her worth was deemed less than nothing. They called her burdensome, plain and unwelcome shadow in the bright, cruel sun of Providence Gulch. Her own father, broken by desperation, offered her up like chattel to settle a debt. In a moment of public humiliation that would curdle the soul, she was mocked, rejected, and cast aside. But as the laughter of her tormentors echoed, another voice cut through the noise, a voice deep, quiet, and dangerous. It belonged to a man the townsfolk feared, a Lakota warrior who saw not a burden, but a treasure. And in front of everyone who had scorned her, he made a single, world-shattering declaration: "She will be my bride." This is the story of that claim and the life it forged in fire and faith. The dust of Providence Gulch had a taste. It was a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the land's indifference. For Clara May Thompson, it tasted of loneliness. At 22, she was an immovable feature of her father's failing general store, as much a fixture as the pickle barrel or the sacks of flour, and in the eyes of the townsfolk just as plain. Clara May was not built like the other women in the territory. While they were willowy and wiry, shaped by scarcity and hard labor, she was soft and rounded, with wide hips and a full bosom that her drab calico dresses did little to conceal. Her face, framed by waves of unassuming brown hair, was kind, with gentle blue eyes that often sought refuge in the pages of the few worn books she kept hidden beneath the counter. In a world that valued utility above all, Clara May's form was seen as a sign of idleness, of a burdensome appetite. Her father, Bartholomew Thompson, a man whose dreams had long since been eroded by the Dakota winds, saw her much the same way. "Too much of you, Clara May," he'd mutter, his eyes lingering on her as she moved through the cramped aisles of their store. "Takes more to feed, more to clothe. A man looks for a filly, not a draft horse." The words, meant to be casual observations, were tiny, sharp stones thrown against her spirit day after day. The primary source of their town's scorn and her father's anxiety was the Croft family. Thaddeus Croft owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, the C-Bar-C, and held the mortgage on nearly every business in Providence Gulch, including the Thompson General Store. His son, Alden Croft, was the town's princely brute. He was handsome in a harsh, sun-scoured way, with a swagger in his step and a cruelty that lurked just behind his charming smile. He and his coterie of ranch hands treated Clara May as their personal sport. They would saunter into the store, their spurs ringing on the floorboards, and Alden would lean against the counter, his gaze sweeping over her with theatrical disdain. Still here, Clara May thought a strong gust might have rolled you down to the river by now. His friends would snicker their laughter, a coarse, ugly sound in the quiet store. She learned to make herself small to stare at the wooden countertop, counting the knots in the grain until they left the scent of leather and cheap whiskey fouling the air behind them. Clara May found her escape in books, an old copy of Shakespeare, a tattered book of poetry by a Mrs. Browning, and a dog-eared volume on botany. In their pages, she could travel to Verona, listen to sonnets, and learn the Latin names for the resilient prairie flowers that, like her, managed to bloom despite the harsh conditions. She knew that Ratibida columnifera was the prairie coneflower, a simple fact, perhaps, but one that held power. It was a piece of secret knowledge, a quiet act of defiance, a small, bright world of beauty and intellect that Alden Croft and his kind could never touch. The trouble, however, was escalating. Bartholomew was 3 months behind on his payment to Thaddeus Croft. The whispers in town grew louder, suggesting the Thompsons would soon be destitute, cast out, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The fear in her father's eyes became a constant, desperate gleam. He started drinking more, his evenings spent, hunched over the store's ledger, the numbers refusing to bend to his will. One Tuesday evening, the bell above the store door chimed, and Thaddeus Croft entered, flanked by his son Alden. The elder Croft was a bull of a man, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. "Bartholomew," Thaddeus began, his voice a low rumble. "The ledger. Let's see it." Clara May retreated to the back room, ostensibly to organize stock, but she pressed her ear to the thin wooden door. She heard the scrape of the heavy book being dragged across the counter, the tense silence, and then Thaddeus Croft's humorless chuckle. "It's worse than I thought," the rancher said. "You're finished, Thompson. I'm calling the note at the end of the week." "Thaddeus, please," Bartholomew begged, his voice thin and reedy. "There must be another way. A trade. Anything." There was a long pause. Clara May held her breath. It was Alden who spoke next, his voice slick with a dreadful dawning idea. "Well, father," Alden drawled, "Thompson does have one. Large asset he hasn't accounted for." Clara May's blood ran cold. She knew. Before the words were even fully formed, she knew. "What are you suggesting?" Bartholomew asked, a note of confusion in his tone. "A union," Thaddeus Croft said, catching his son's meaning instantly. "A merger of sorts. My boy Alden is of an age to marry. A wife would settle him. Your daughter, Clara May." Clara May felt a wave of nausea. Marry Alden, the man who had spent years making her life a misery. It was a monstrous proposition. My Clara May," her father stammered. "Wipe the debt clean," Thaddeus offered. "The store is yours free and clear. My son marries your daughter. A simple, elegant solution. It secures your future, Bartholomew. And it gives my boy a wife who, well, she's certainly built to survive a hard winter." The men chuckled. From the other side of the door, Clara May could hear her father's frantic, desperate breathing. She heard the war within him, the love for his daughter, however flawed, and conditional fighting against the crushing weight of his failure. The silence stretched on an eternity of indecision. Finally, Bartholomew spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Agreed. A single word. A death sentence." Clara May backed away from the door, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She stumbled over a crate of tinned peaches, the clatter loud in the sudden silence of her world. The door creaked open, and her father's face appeared, his expression a wretched mask of shame and relief. "Clara May," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "It's for the best." But as she looked past him, she saw Alden Croft in the doorway, a smirk of triumphant cruelty on his handsome face. He wasn't just acquiring a wife, he was conquering his favorite victim. In his eyes, she saw not the promise of a shared future, but a lifetime of mockery, a private stage for his endless derision. The dust of Providence Gulch had never tasted so bitter. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. News of the impending union spread through Providence Gulch like a prairie fire, fueled by gossip and disbelief. The arrangement was so bizarre, so cruelly transactional, that it became the sole topic of conversation at the saloon, the smithy, and over every washboard and fence post in town. The consensus was a mix of pity for Clara May and a kind of morbid fascination. It was a spectacle, and the whole town was eager for the main event. Bartholomew, steeped in a miasma of whiskey and self-justification, avoided his daughter's gaze. He spoke of the arrangement in practical terms, as if it were a land deal. "Your future is secure, Clara May. You'll be the wife of the wealthiest man in the territory one day. You won't want for anything." He refused to see the silent tears that traced paths through the flour dust on her cheeks, or the way her hands trembled as she stocked the shelves. Clara May felt as though she were moving through water. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts slow and muffled by a thick fog of despair. The books that were once her refuge now seemed to mock her, with tales of true love and noble heroines. She was no heroine. She was a commodity, a bag of grain being traded to settle a debt. The day of the formal agreement was set for Friday. Thaddeus Croft, a man who loved public displays of his own power, decreed that the bargain would be sealed not in a stuffy office, but in the open on the porch of the Grand Saloon for all of Providence Gulch to witness. It was to be a demonstration of his influence and his son's supposed magnanimity. That morning Clara May's father laid out her best dress, a somber grey wool garment that made her feel even more shapeless. "Put this on," he ordered, his voice gruff. "Try to look presentable." She wanted to refuse, to scream, to lock herself in her room. But a lifetime of obedience and the crushing sense of inevitability weighed her down. She dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Looking at her reflection in the cracked mirror, she saw a ghost, a pale, frightened woman with eyes that had already surrendered. When they stepped outside, the entire town seemed to be waiting. People lined the dusty street, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. Children pointed, and women whispered behind their hands. It was a gauntlet of shame. As she walked beside her father toward the saloon, each step felt like a mile. The sun beat down hot and merciless. The Croft men were waiting on the saloon porch. Thaddeus stood chest puffed out like a king, holding court. Alden lounged against a post, a cocky, indolent smirk on his face. He was dressed in his finest, a tailored black coat, a clean white shirt, and polished boots. He looked like a groom, and the sight made Clara May's stomach clench. Bartholomew, holding a single sheet of paper, the deed to his store, pushed Clara May forward. As agreed," he stammered, his voice cracking. "My daughter Clara May, for the forgiveness of my debt." Thaddeus Croft nodded grandly. "A fair bargain." Alden pushed himself off the post and sauntered toward Clara May. He circled her slowly, like a wolf inspecting a sheep, his eyes filled with a theatrical, appraising scorn. The crowd fell silent, holding a collective breath. He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the bay rum on his skin. He didn't look at her face. Instead, his gaze traveled slowly, deliberately down her body, and then back up again. "Well, father," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the street, "I've considered your proposal. I've thought long and hard on it." He paused, letting the tension build. "And I have to say, no." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Bartholomew's face went white with shock. "What, Alden, we had a deal!" Alden let out a short, barking laugh. "A deal. We had a discussion, and I've decided this asset," he gestured dismissively at Clara, "May is not worth the price. Look at her. She's hardly a bride. She's a provision for a long journey. I'd need a bigger ranch just to graze her." The crowd erupted. Some gasped in shock at the sheer cruelty, but many, especially Alden's cronies, howled with laughter. The sound was a physical blow to Clara May. It crashed over her, stealing her breath, buckling her knees. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through the fog of her despair. She stood frozen, her face burning, the world narrowing to Alden's sneering face. "But the debt," her father cried, his voice frantic. "The debt stands," Thaddeus Croft said, coolly, his part in the cruel play now clear. It was never about a marriage. It was about utter subjugation. You have until sundown tomorrow to pay, or you'll be out on the street." Bartholomew Thompson crumbled. The last vestige of his pride, his hope, his dignity, shattered right there on the dusty street. He stared at his daughter, not with pity, but with a new, horrifying resentment. She was the cause of this. She was the worthless asset that had failed to save him. Fueled by whiskey and raw despair, he grabbed Clara May's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He shoved her forward into the center of the mocking crowd. "Then take her," he screamed, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the afternoon. Anyone, I'm giving her away. Take this burden off my hands. For $1, for a drink, for nothing. Just take her." The crowd recoiled. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a man selling his own flesh and blood. Clara May stood alone in a circle of horrified and fascinated faces, abandoned by her father, rejected by her tormentor, an object of pity and disgust. The silence was absolute, broken only by her father's ragged sobs. The world had ended. There was nothing left. And from the edge of the crowd, in the long shadow of the livery stable, a figure detached himself from the wall. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements fluid and silent. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple cloth shirt, and his long black hair was held back by a leather band. He was Lakota, a face the townsfolk recognized from the trading parties that sometimes came to town, but whom they never truly saw. He moved with a purpose that parted the crowd, his moccasins making no sound in the thick dust. He walked past the stunned faces of the townsfolk, past the sputtering Bartholomew, past the suddenly wary Alden Croft. He walked directly to the center of the circle and stopped in front of the trembling, broken form of Clara May Thompson. The warrior's presence changed the air. The afternoon heat, which had been oppressive and stifling, now felt charged electric. The silence of the crowd was no longer one of morbid curiosity. It was a silence of fear. The men of Providence Gulch saw him not as a man, but as a symbol of the wild, untamable land that surrounded their fragile settlement. Their bluster and arrogance evaporated, replaced by a primal caution. He was Wambly Gleska, known to the few white traders who dared deal with him as Spotted Eagle. His face was a striking landscape of high cheekbones and a strong jaw, his dark eyes holding a deep, unnerving intelligence. He looked at nothing and no one but Clara May. He saw not the burden her father had screamed about, nor the provision Alden had mocked. His gaze was steady assessing and devoid of the pity or scorn she had known her entire life. It was something else, entirely something she could not name. Clara May, who had been staring at the ground, willing it to swallow her whole, slowly lifted her head. Her vision was blurry with unshed tears, but she saw him clearly. She had seen him before, on the rare occasions his people came to the store. He was always quiet, watchful, standing apart from the others. He never haggled or spoke unnecessarily. He simply took what he needed, paid with well-tanned pelts, and left. They had never exchanged a single word. Alden Croft, recovering some of his bravado, stepped forward. "What do you want, Injun? This isn't your affair." Spotted Eagle did not turn his head. His focus remained entirely on Clara May. He spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried a resonance that cut through the tension. His English was measured, each word carefully chosen. "This man," he said with a slight nod toward Bartholomew, "gives this woman away." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He was drunk, talking nonsense. Bartholomew stammered sobriety and terror, dawning on him in equal measure. It was just words. "Your words have power." Spotted Eagle replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He finally turned his gaze from Clara May and swept it over the crowd, over Alden, and finally settled on her father. "You cast her out. You said anyone." A shudder went through the crowd. They understood. In their own world, a drunken man's words could be dismissed, but they sensed instinctively that in the warrior's world, a word spoken with such passion, such finality could not be unsaid. It was a binding oath. Spotted Eagle took a step closer to Clara May. She flinched a lifetime of fear of the unknown welling up inside her. He stopped, immediately respecting the invisible boundary between them. He addressed her directly, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "They see you with hollow eyes. They see weakness. They do not see the spirit of one who endures." His words struck her more profoundly than Alden's insults. He saw her. He saw endurance. She had only ever seen herself as a creature of patience, of passive suffering. But he had named it endurance, and the word landed in her soul like a seed. He then turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with Alden Croft's. "You mock her form. In my world, a woman of substance is a sign of prosperity. She promises strong children and a warm lodge in the winter. She is a blessing from Wakantanka. You are a boy who values trinkets over treasure." Alden's face flushed with rage. "You have no right. I have the right of the claim." Spotted Eagle interrupted, his voice hardening. "Her own father cast her away. I will take her." Bartholomew lunged forward, grabbing at his daughter's arm. "No, you can't. She's my—" "You named her your burden." The warrior said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "I will relieve you of it." He looked back at Clara May, a question now in his eyes. It was the first time all day anyone had asked for her consent, even silently. He was not taking. He was offering an escape. What was he offering? A life she couldn't imagine in a world she had been taught to fear. A life among savages, as the townspeople called them. But what was the alternative to stay here, in this town that had just witnessed her utter debasement? To live under the roof of a father who had tried to sell her and then discard her? To endure the unending, triumphant scorn of Alden Croft? The choice was between a familiar hell and a terrifying unknown. She looked at her father's pathetic, pleading face. She looked at Alden's furious, hateful one. She looked at the faces in the crowd, gawking, whispering, judging. There was no safety here. No kindness. No future. Then she looked back at the Lakota warrior. In his stoic expression, she saw something that had been absent from her life for as long as she could remember respect. He had not pitied her. He had defended her. Slowly, deliberately, she took a single step away from her father and toward Spotted Eagle. It was the most difficult, most powerful step of her life. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Bartholomew's hand fell away from her arm as if burned. "Clara May, no." Spotted Eagle held out his hand. It was not a command, but an invitation. His palm was calloused and strong. She hesitated for only a moment more, then placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and reassuring. He looked at the crowd, a silent challenge in his eyes. "She is my kin now." Then he looked directly at Bartholomew. "I take nothing. I offer a trade so no man can say she was given for free." He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out 3 flawless eagle feathers, their white tips stark against the dark plumage. He tossed them onto the dusty ground in front of Bartholomew. "For the spirit you tried to break." Then, without another word, he turned his hand, still holding hers, and began to lead her away from the saloon, away from the crowd, away from the entire life she had ever known. The townsfolk parted before them, like a river around a great stone. Clara May did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, buckskin-clad back of the man who had called her a treasure, a blessing. As they reached the edge of town, where a strong-looking pony stood waiting, he finally spoke again. His voice, a low murmur, meant only for her. "They call you Clara May," he said. "I will call you Eagle Woman, for you have a spirit that chose to fly when they tried to cage you." And for the first time in years, Clara May felt not the crushing weight of her body, but the impossible lightness of hope. The journey began in silence. Spotted Eagle lifted Clara May onto the back of his dappled grey pony, with an ease that belied his lean frame, then swung up behind her. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the pony's mane, acutely aware of his solid presence at her back. The warmth of his body, a startling contrast to the cold dread that had settled in her bones. As they rode out of Providence Gulch, she could feel the eyes of the entire town on her back, a burning final judgment. They moved east away from the setting sun toward the rolling plains and the shadowed outline of the Black Hills, the Pahasapa, a place of myth and fear for the settlers. The landscape that had always been a distant backdrop to her life now became her reality. The familiar dusty street gave way to an endless sea of prairie grass, waving like water in the evening breeze. The sky was immense, a dome of deepening blue pricked with the first stars. In Providence, Gulch, the world had been small and suffocating. Out here, it was terrifyingly vast. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Clara May was a storm of conflicting emotions. There was the terror of the unknown, the residual sting of her public humiliation, and a deep, aching sorrow for the life she was leaving, however miserable it had been. But underneath it all, a fragile tendril of something else was taking root. It was the feeling of motion, of forward momentum. For the first time, she was not standing still, waiting for the next blow. She was moving toward something. The silence was finally broken by Spotted Eagle. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. She jumped, startled. "A little," she managed to whisper. He guided the pony into a small hollow, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees near a trickling creek. He slid off the horse, and then helped her down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. He moved with an efficient grace, gathering dry wood, striking a flint to create a spark, and coaxing a small, smokeless fire to life. The entire process took only a few minutes. From a leather pack he produced a strip of dried meat, papa, and a small pouch of dried berries. He handed them to her. "It is not much," he said. The jerky was tough and salty but nourishing. The berries were sweet and tart, a burst of flavor on her tongue. As she ate, she watched him. He did not eat himself, but sat by the fire, sharpening the blade of a knife on a smooth river stone. The firelight played across the planes of his face, making him seem both older and more mysterious than he had in the harsh light of town. "Why?" She asked the question, escaping her before she could stop it. He paused his work, looking up at her. His dark eyes were reflective in the firelight. "Why? Why did you do that?" "For me," she clarified, her voice trembling slightly. He considered the question for a long time, the only sound the whisper of the steel on the stone. "In my people," he began, his English careful and deliberate. "We have a story about the Iktomi the spider. He is a trickster. He weaves webs of lies and vanity to trap the foolish. Your town is one of his webs." He set the knife down. "I saw you in your father's store. You do not speak much. You watch. You listen. You read the strange markings in your books. There is a stillness in you. But today in the street, I saw that stillness break. I saw your spirit fighting to be free of the web." He looked away from her, then into the fire. Alden Croft and his father. They are men who believe they own the world. They think strength is in what you can take from others. My people believe strength is in what you can give, in what you can protect. He paused. To leave you there would have been wrong. It would have made my own spirit weak. Clara May was stunned into silence. No one had ever spoken of her spirit. They had only ever spoken of her body, her cost, her burden. He saw something inside her, something she herself had barely known was there. That night he laid out a thick buffalo robe for her near the fire and took up a position, a respectful distance away, his back against a tree, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Clara May lay down, but she could not sleep. Every rustle of the leaves, every cry of a distant coyote sent a jolt of fear through her. This was the wilderness she had been taught to dread, the domain of wolves and savage men. Yet the only savage man she knew was sitting vigil a few feet away, a silent guardian. The fear was real, but it was also abstract. The memory of Alden Croft's sneer was a more immediate and painful wound. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her, and she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The next few days unfolded in a similar pattern. They rode during the day, covering miles of open country. Spotted Eagle taught her how to sit the horse properly, how to move with its rhythm to avoid tiring. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poison. He pointed out the tracks of deer and antelope. He spoke of the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a living entity, a relative. "The earth is Grandmother Earth," he explained, pointing to a field of wild flowers. "She provides for us. We do not tear her skin with plows." Clara May, the girl who had secretly studied botany from a tattered book, was fascinated. His knowledge was not academic. It was alive, practical, woven into the fabric of his existence. She started to see the prairie not as a monotonous expanse of grass, but as a complex and beautiful tapestry of life. The journey began to change her. The sun browned her skin, and the constant riding strengthened muscles she hadn't known she possessed. Her heavy wool dress, impractical and stifling, was a constant source of frustration. One afternoon, while they were watering the pony at a river, she impulsively tore a long strip from the bottom of her hem, freeing her ankles. Spotted Eagle watched her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. It was a small act of rebellion, a shedding of her old self. Their conversations grew longer. She told him about her books, about Shakespeare and poetry. He did not mock her. He listened intently, asking questions about the stories. In return, he told her of the Lakota heroes of Crazy Horse and the White Buffalo Calf Woman. She discovered he had a quiet sense of humor and a deep well of patience. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a profound realization washed over her. In the whole time they had been traveling, he had not once mentioned her size. He had not looked at her with disdain or criticism. He helped her onto the horse because it was practical. He shared food with her because she was his companion. Her physical form was simply a fact, like the color of her hair or the sky. For the first time in her life, she felt normal. She felt like a person, not a problem. On the fourth day, they crested a high ridge. Below them, nestled in a wide green valley, bisected by a sparkling river, was a large encampment of teepees. Smoke curled lazily into the afternoon sky, and the sounds of dogs barking and children laughing drifted up to them on the wind. "My home," Spotted Eagle said simply. Clara May's heart hammered in her chest. The journey with him had been a strange, quiet interlude between two worlds. Now the second world was before her. The terror she had suppressed rushed back. She was a white woman, an outsider. The town of Providence, Gulch had rejected her for being different. Why would these people be any kinder? Spotted Eagle seemed to sense her fear. He turned to her, his expression serious. "You are Winyan Wanbley," he said, using the name he had given her. "You are with me. Walk with your head high. You have endured the spider's web. This is a place of people, not spiders." He held out his hand, an echo of his gesture in the dusty street. This time she took it without hesitation. Her hand was no longer trembling. It was steady. As they began their descent into the valley, she did not feel like a prisoner being delivered, but a traveler, arriving at a new, uncertain, but not entirely unwelcome shore. The arrival in the Lakota camp was as overwhelming as Clara May had feared, but not in the way she had expected. There was no open hostility, no glares of hatred. Instead, she was met with an intense, unblinking curiosity. People stopped what they were doing, women scraping hides, men mending tools, children playing games with stones, and simply stared. They stared at her pale skin, her strange and cumbersome dress, and the way she clung to Spotted Eagle's side. She was an anomaly, a creature from another world dropped into their midst. Spotted Eagle led her through the camp toward a large, well-kept tipi set slightly apart from the others. An older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her long grey hair in 2 neat braids, emerged from the entrance. Her eyes, as dark and intelligent as Spotted Eagle's, took in the scene, at a glance, lingering on Clara May with an unreadable expression. Mother Spotted Eagle said in Lakota before switching to English for Clara May's benefit. "This is Clara May. I have named her Winyan Wanbley." The woman whose name Clara May would learn was Winona looked her up and down. Clara May braced herself for the familiar judgment, the assessment of her size. But Winona's gaze was different. It was practical, like a farmer assessing livestock, but without the connotation of ownership. It was an appraisal of health, of strength. Winona then surprised her by reaching out and touching Clara May's arm, her fingers gently squeezing the flesh. She grunted a sound that seemed to hold a measure of approval, and then said something in Lakota to her son. A small, genuine smile touched Spotted Eagle's lips. "My mother says you have good substance. She says you will not be swept away by the wind." The simple pragmatic acceptance was so contrary to everything Clara May had ever experienced that she felt a sudden sharp urge to cry. She blinked back the tears, nodding dumbly at Winona, who gestured for her to enter the teepee. The inside was spacious and clean, with a fire pit in the center, and buffalo robes arranged neatly for sleeping and sitting. It was a home, and the realization that this was to be her home was dizzying. Life in the camp was a constant, difficult lesson in humility. Everything she knew was useless here. She couldn't tan a hide bead a moccasin or distinguish the calls of different birds. Her movements were clumsy in her restrictive dress, and she was always in the way. The language was a barrier that left her feeling isolated and foolish. Suspicion came not from everyone, but from a few. A young woman named Tashina, whose beauty was sharp and fierce, watched Clara May with open disdain. Clara May learned through gestures and the few Lakota words she picked up that Tashina had hoped to be Spotted Eagle's wife. To her, Clara May was not just an outsider, but a pale, soft usurper. Tashina and her friends would often speak quickly in Lakota, as Clara May passed their laughter, following her like a trail of sharp stones. It was a painful echo of her life in Providence Gulch. But where there was suspicion, there was also unexpected kindness. Winona, though stern, took Clara May under her wing. She communicated with a universal language of gestures and demonstrations. She showed Clara May how to grind corn, how to find wild turnips, and how to sew with an awl and sinew. The work was hard, leaving her hands raw and her muscles aching, but it was satisfying. For the first time, she was contributing her body's strength, a useful tool, rather than a shameful attribute. Winona also addressed the problem of her dress. One afternoon she presented Clara May with a simple, sleeveless tunic made of soft, smoked deer skin. It reached her knees and was far more practical than the heavy wool she had worn. When Clara May put it on, she felt a profound sense of liberation. With it came a pair of moccasins that made walking on the uneven ground a quiet, natural act. In her new clothes, she felt less like a clumsy outsider and more a part of the landscape itself. Her relationship with Spotted Eagle was a slow, quiet unfolding. They were not man and wife in the way she understood it. He slept on the opposite side of the teepee, never touching her, always maintaining a respectful distance. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language she was beginning to understand. He would leave a wildflower on her sleeping robe in the morning. When she struggled to carry a heavy water skin from the river, he would appear at her side and take it from her without a word. He began to teach her the Lakota language in the evenings, pointing to objects and giving her their names. She was a quick study, her bookish mind eager for the patterns and sounds of the new words. Learning the language began to unlock the world around her. The whispers were no longer just a hostile noise. She could start to pick out words to understand the rhythm of camp life. One evening, as they sat outside the teepee watching the stars, she finally worked up the courage to ask him about their strange arrangement. "In my world," she began hesitantly, "a man and a woman who are to be married. It is different." He looked at her, his face serene in the moonlight. "I made a claim to protect you," he said. "I brought you to my home to give you sanctuary. I will not force you into the sleeping robes of a man you do not know. But you called me your bride," she whispered. "To be my bride is a choice you must make," he answered. "Not just with your words, but with your heart. When you no longer see yourself as the woman from that town, but as Wingyan Wang Bli, a woman of the Lakota people, that is the day you will be my bride." His respect for her autonomy was a gift more precious than any jewel. He was not her owner. He was her guardian, her teacher, and he was offering her the chance to choose her own identity. Her transformation was gradual. The softness of her body hardened into functional strength. She learned to laugh with the other women as they worked their initial suspicion, giving way to a grudging acceptance and from some genuine friendship. She discovered that her physical size, once a source of deep shame, was truly seen as a positive attribute here. "A woman should have something to hold on to when the north wind blows," one of the older women named Chappa said with a wink, making Clara May blush and smile at the same time. She found her own unique way to contribute. Her knowledge of reading and writing, a useless skill in Providence Gulch, became a curiosity here. She began to draw the plants she knew from her botany book, writing down their Lakota names next to the Latin ones, creating a record that fascinated the elders. She would tell the children stories from her Shakespeare book, simplifying the language, turning Romeo and Juliet into a tragic tale of warring tribes that they found captivating. Her heart, which she had thought shattered beyond repair, began to heal. It mended itself with the quiet respect of Spotted Eagle, the gruff affection of Winona, and the simple, profound acceptance of a people who judged her not by her waistline, but by the strength of her hands and the kindness in her spirit. One cool evening, months after her arrival, she sat with Spotted Eagle by the fire. He was carving a piece of wood, his hands skilled and sure. She had spent the day helping Winona prepare a buffalo hide, a smelly, exhausting task she had completed without complaint. She felt tired but deeply content. She looked at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the flames, and a feeling of warmth and certainty spread through her chest. It wasn't a dramatic storybook passion. It was something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was a feeling of home. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He stopped his carving and looked at her, his eyes questioning. "Wambly Gleska," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am Winyan Wambly." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually stoic expression. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He put down his carving, took her hand, and for the first time, drew her close. The harmony Clara May had found was as fragile as a spider's thread in a gale. In Providence, Gulch, the story of her abduction, had festered, twisting into a dark and ugly legend. It was no longer a tale of a drunken father and a cruel suitor, but one of a savage warrior stealing a helpless white woman. Alden Croft, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, fanned the flames of this narrative. He portrayed himself as the town's would-be savior, cheated of his chance to rescue the poor, unfortunate Clara May Thompson. The fact that Spotted Eagle's band had recently been implicated falsely in the disappearance of a few head of cattle from the Seabar Sea Ranch gave Alden the pretext he needed. It was no longer about a woman. It was about property, about order, about demonstrating the dominance of the white settlers over the hostiles. Thaddeus Croft, seeing an opportunity to expand his grazing lands into territory respected by treaty, gave his son his blessing. Alden gathered a posse of 12 men, a mix of ranch hands and town drunks, all armed and emboldened by whiskey and self-righteous fury. Their stated mission was to retrieve the stolen cattle and liberate Clara May. Their real mission was vengeance and violence. Back in the Lakota camp, life continued its peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the approaching storm. Clara May, now truly Winyan Wambly to herself and others, had fully settled into her new life. Her bond with Spotted Eagle had deepened into a partnership of quiet affection and profound mutual respect. They were to be formally joined in a ceremony in 2 days' time. The camp was in a state of quiet, happy preparation. The first sign of trouble was a lone rider, a young Lakota scout named Chayton, who appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, his pony lathered in sweat. He galloped into the camp, shouting a warning. A large party of armed white men was approaching from the west, moving fast. The mood of the camp shifted instantly from peace to high alert. Panic was not an option. Preparation was everything. The elders, led by a wise chief named Black Buffalo, gathered with the warriors. Spotted Eagle stood among them, his face grim, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Clara May's heart turned to ice. She knew with a sickening certainty who was coming and why. The past she thought she had escaped was riding toward her with rifles and ropes. Fear, cold and familiar, gripped her. But this time it was different. It was not just fear for herself, but for these people who had shown her kindness, for the home she had found, for the man she had come to love. She ran to Spotted Eagle's side as the council of warriors dispersed to prepare their defenses. "It's Alden Croft," she said, her voice urgent. "He's come for me." Spotted Eagle's eyes hardened. "He has come for an excuse to shed our blood and steal our land," he corrected her gently but firmly. "You are the excuse." He gripped her shoulder. "Winona will take you with the children and the other women to the sheltered caves in the hills. You must go. You must be safe." "No." Clara May said the word, coming out with a strength that surprised even herself. "I will not hide. This is my fault. I am the reason they are here." "You are not a fault," he insisted. "You are one of us. They are here because of their own greed and hate." "Then let me help," she pleaded. "I know him. I know how he thinks. He is arrogant. He underestimates everyone. He will be expecting us to fight like savages from his storybooks. He won't be expecting us to be smart." Spotted Eagle looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. He saw not the frightened girl from Providence Gulch, but Wingyan Wangbli Eagle Woman, his chosen partner. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "What do you suggest?" Clara May's mind, once filled with poetry and botany, raced through the practicalities of a siege. She thought of the stories of strategy she had read, but more importantly, she thought of the land her new people had taught her. "The west approach is narrow through that rocky gorge," she said, pointing. "He'll expect an ambush there, so he'll be cautious. But what if the ambush isn't what he thinks? Not just warriors with bows?" She turned to the women who had gathered around, their faces anxious. "We can help, not with weapons, but with the land itself." The idea took root, while the warriors, a small force of no more than 20 men, prepared for a direct defense of the camp. Clara May, Winona Tashina, and the other women went to work. Guided by Clara May's frantic energy and the elders' deep knowledge of the terrain, they set about creating a series of traps and diversions in the narrow gorge. They used their knowledge of plants to gather nettles and burrs, hiding them in thick patches along the trail where the horses would be forced to walk. They loosened rocks on the high cliffs, setting them to be tumbled with a single push of a lever made from a sturdy branch. Their most ingenious idea came from Clara May's memory of something she had read about acoustics. The gorge had a peculiar echo. A small group of boys hidden safely in the cliffs was instructed to use animal calls and beat on dried hides, creating the illusion of a much larger force surrounding the posse from all sides. As dusk began to fall, Alden Croft and his men rode into the gorge. Their horses, spooked by the strange echoing noises, became skittish. As they moved deeper, they hit the patches of nettles, and the animals began to panic, rearing and bucking in pain and confusion. The men unnerved by the sounds, and their unruly mounts became a disorganized mob. At that moment, from high above, a single piercing cry of an eagle echoed through the gorge, Spotted Eagle's signal. On cue, the women and older men pushed their levers, and a shower of rocks and small boulders rained down, not on the men themselves, but in front of them, and behind them, blocking their path of retreat and advance. It was a rock slide, perfectly orchestrated. Panic erupted. Horses screamed, men shouted in confusion and fear, their shots firing wildly into the shadows. From the end of the gorge, Spotted Eagle and his warriors appeared not as a charging horde, but as silent, deadly phantoms using the chaos to their advantage. They picked off the posse's horses with well-aimed arrows, dismounting the men and leaving them stranded. Alden thrown from his horse, and his arrogance shattered by the terrifying, invisible enemy, found himself face to face with Spotted Eagle. The two men circled each other in the gloom. "I've come for what's mine," Alden snarled, drawing his pistol. "She was never yours," Spotted Eagle said, his voice dangerously calm. "She was never a thing to be owned." Alden fired, but his shot was wild, his hands trembling. Spotted Eagle moved with blinding speed, not with a weapon, but with his hands. He closed the distance, knocked the gun from Alden's grasp, and struck him hard in the jaw. Alden crumpled to the ground unconscious. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The posse, leaderless, horseless, and utterly demoralized, surrendered, throwing down their weapons. They had been defeated not by overwhelming force, but by superior strategy, a deep understanding of the land and the cleverness of a woman they had once dismissed as worthless. Clara May watched from a safe distance, her heart pounding. When she saw Alden fall and the surrender of his men, a wave of relief so profound washed over her that she felt her knees weaken. Tashina, the woman who had once been her rival, came to her side and placed a supportive hand on her arm. In her eyes was a new look respect. In that moment they were not rivals but sisters who had defended their home together. Clara May had not only earned her place, she had helped save it. The aftermath of the brief battle was grimly efficient. Alden Croft and his defeated men were brought before a council fire, surrounded by the Lakota elders led by Chief Black Buffalo. Alden, his fine clothes torn and his arrogance replaced by a sullen terror, was forced to his knees. Chief Black Buffalo, his gaze wise, turned not to the captive, but to Clara May. Winyan Wanbli, he said, his voice carrying in the tense silence. You are the reason they came. What is your judgment? Power surged through Clara. The chance for revenge for a lifetime of mockery was intoxicating. But looking at Alden's pathetic, hate-filled face, she knew vengeance would only tie her to the ugliness of her past. She stepped into the firelight, her voice strong. Killing a hollow man only empties you, she said, speaking in a mix of English and Lakota. His punishment should be to live with his shame. Send them back on foot. Make them tell the truth that they were defeated by a people protecting their home and outsmarted by the woman they called a burden. Let them tell Providence Gulch that Winyan Wanbli is not a captive. She is home. The council murmured its approval. The next morning, Alden's posse was disarmed and began their long, humiliating walk back to civilization, their pride in tatters. With the last shadow of her past banished, the postponed joining ceremony took place. Spotted Eagle draped a beautifully beaded buffalo robe around their shoulders, binding them as one family. Months later, they sat on a hillside overlooking the valley their home. Clara May placed her husband's hand on her slightly swelling belly. They said I was a burden, she murmured, that I was too much. Spotted Eagle smiled, his hand gentle on the new life they had created. They were right, he said softly. You were too much for their small world to contain. But you are just enough for ours. She leaned against him, finally at peace, a woman who had found her worth not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the Old West, to the story of Clara May Thompson, a woman cast out by cruelty, who found her true home in a place she least expected. Her story reminds us that worth is not determined by the shallow judgments of others, but by the strength and endurance of the human spirit. It shows us that sometimes the greatest acts of love don't come in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, steady gaze of someone who sees the treasure within you when no one else does. If this story of resilience, courage, and unexpected love touched your heart, please help us share more tales like it. Take a moment to hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. Most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter of history we bring to life. Thank you for listening, and until next time, walk with your head held high.